Imagine your own father calling you a worthless show-off in front of your entire family, mocking the very talent that would one day have world leaders personally requesting your presence. Well, that's exactly what happened to me. And the moment my dad realized what he'd been wrong about all these years, he literally fainted, right there on the kitchen floor. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. It started when I was 7 years old, sitting in our cramped apartment in Detroit, watching my mom struggle through a phone call with our landlord, Mr. Petrov. She kept switching between broken English and frustrated gestures, trying to explain that our heating wasn't working. I could hear the impatience in his voice even from across the room. "Mom, he's speaking Russian," I said quietly. "I can help." She looked at me like I just claimed I could fly, but something in my voice made her hand me the phone. Within 5 minutes, I'd not only explained our heating problem in fluent Russian, but I'd also negotiated a rent reduction for the inconvenience. Mr. Petrov was so impressed that he started teaching me more complex Russian phrases during his monthly visits. That was my first taste of what languages could do. But my dad, Marcus Henderson, saw it differently. "Stop filling the boy's head with nonsense, Elena," he told my mom that night. "He needs to focus on real skills, math, science, not this party trick garbage." My mom, Elena Kozlov, before she married my dad, had immigrated from Ukraine when she was 18. She understood the power of languages. But my father? He was a third-generation American who believed anything foreign was suspicious. He worked double shifts at the Ford plant and came home exhausted, beer in hand, ready to criticize whatever didn't fit his narrow view of success. But I couldn't stop. Languages called to me like music calls to a composer. When our neighbor Mrs. Chen started teaching me Mandarin in exchange for help with her groceries, I absorbed every tone, every character stroke. When the new family from Mexico moved in upstairs, I spent hours with their daughter Isabella, trading English lessons for Spanish fluency. By age 10, I was fluent in 6 languages: English, Russian, Ukrainian, Mandarin, Spanish, and German, thanks to our mailman Klaus, who'd immigrated from Bavaria. Each language opened a new world, a new way of thinking, a new group of people who suddenly saw me as one of their own. My dad's reaction grew more hostile with each new language. "You're turning into some kind of freak, Tyler," he'd say, usually after a few beers. "Normal American kids don't need to speak Chinese or whatever the hell you're babbling about now." The breaking point came during my freshman year of high school. I'd just mastered Italian thanks to my part-time job at Marino's Pizza, where old Mr. Marino would only speak to me in his native tongue. I was excited to share this achievement at dinner, but the moment I mentioned it, my dad exploded. "Enough!" He slammed his fist on the table so hard that my mom's water glass toppled over. "I'm sick of this ridiculous obsession. You think you're better than us? You think speaking a bunch of foreign languages makes you special? Dad, I just think it's cool that I can..." "It's not cool, Tyler. It's weird. It's un-American. And it's not going to get you anywhere in life." His face was red with anger. "You want to know what gets you somewhere? Hard work. Real skills. Not this show-off nonsense." My mom tried to intervene. "Marcus, please. Tyler has a gift." "A gift?" He laughed bitterly. "It's a waste of time. And I won't have my son turning into some kind of circus act." That night, lying in bed, I made a decision that would change everything. If my dad thought languages were worthless, I'd prove him wrong. Not out of spite, but out of a deep belief that understanding other cultures, other people, other ways of thinking, was one of the most valuable things a person could do. I started learning Arabic from a customer at the electronics store where I got a weekend job, then Portuguese from a Brazilian exchange student at school. French came next, through online courses I accessed at the library. By my junior year, I was conversational in 9 languages, and I'd started learning Japanese and Korean simultaneously. But I kept it quiet at home. The languages became my secret world, my escape from my father's constant disapproval. I'd practice with native speakers I met around the city. I'd watch foreign films with subtitles until I didn't need them anymore. I'd read literature in its original form. Each new language felt like gaining a superpower. My teachers started to notice. Mrs. Patterson, my English teacher, recommended me for a summer program at the University of Michigan's Center for Global Languages. When I got accepted with a full scholarship, I knew I had to tell my parents. Absolutely not, my dad said before I'd even finished explaining. You're not wasting your summer on more of this language garbage. You're getting a real job. Construction, manual labor, something that'll teach you actual skills. But Dad, this could lead to scholarships, to college opportunities. College? He snorted. For what? To become a professional tourist? To translate for people who should learn English if they want to live here? That summer, while I was supposed to be working construction, I snuck away to the university program. I told my dad I was working different shifts, and my mom covered for me. It was there that I met Dr. Sarah Blackwood, a linguistics professor who would change my life. Tyler, she said after watching me seamlessly switch between Mandarin, Arabic, and Portuguese during a group exercise, you have something extraordinary. This isn't just talent. This is a gift that could take you anywhere in the world. She introduced me to the concept of simultaneous interpretation, to the world of international diplomacy, to careers I'd never imagined. She told me about interpreters who worked with world leaders, who facilitated peace negotiations, who literally shaped history through their ability to bridge linguistic and cultural divides. But my dad says it's worthless, I confessed one day after class. Dr. Blackwood smiled sadly. Tyler, sometimes the people closest to us are the least capable of seeing our true potential. They're trapped in their own limitations, their own fears. Don't let his fear become your ceiling. By the time I graduated high school, I was fluent in 11 languages: English, Russian, Ukrainian, Mandarin, Spanish, German, Italian, Arabic, Portuguese, French, Japanese, and Korean. I'd been accepted to Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service with a full scholarship. I'd also been recruited by several government agencies who'd somehow heard about my linguistic abilities. But at home, the tension had reached a breaking point. My dad had discovered my deception about the summer program and was furious. The night before I was supposed to leave for Georgetown, he sat me down for what he called, quote, a final conversation. You're making the biggest mistake of your life, he said, his voice eerily calm. You're chasing fantasies. You're going to end up broke, friendless, and unemployed, mumbling in languages nobody cares about. Mark my words, Tyler. This whole language thing is going to be your downfall. I looked at my father, really looked at him, and for the first time I felt pity instead of anger. He was so trapped in his own narrow worldview that he couldn't see the doors his son was opening. He was so afraid of anything different that he'd rather tear down his own child than admit he might be wrong. Maybe you're right, Dad, I said quietly. But I'd rather fail pursuing something I believe in than succeed at something that makes me miserable. The next morning, I left for Georgetown. My mom hugged me tight and whispered in Ukrainian, "Make us proud, my brilliant boy." My dad didn't say goodbye. College was a revelation. I excelled in international relations, added 3 more languages to my repertoire, and started working part-time as a freelance interpreter for the State Department. My professors pushed me toward simultaneous interpretation, the highest level of the profession, where you translate in real time during high-stakes international meetings. The work was intense, demanding perfect fluency not just in vocabulary but in cultural nuances, political subtleties, and technical terminology. But I thrived. Each assignment taught me more about the world, about how language shapes thought, about how understanding truly bridges divides. By my senior year, I was interpreting for senators, ambassadors, and visiting dignitaries. My reputation in the field was growing. Dr. Blackwood, who'd become my mentor, often said I was the most naturally gifted interpreter she'd ever encountered. But back home in Detroit, my relationship with my father remained frozen in disappointment and misunderstanding. 3 years after graduation, I was living in Washington, D.C., working as a senior interpreter for the Department of State. My apartment overlooked the Potomac, and my life had become everything my father said was impossible. I'd interpreted for trade negotiations with Japan, peace talks involving Middle Eastern diplomats, and cultural exchanges with European ministers. Each assignment reinforced what I'd always known. Languages weren't just communication tools, they were bridges between worlds. But success came with isolation. My colleagues respected my abilities, but few understood the journey. My social life revolved around other linguists and diplomats, people who lived between cultures like I did. Dating was complicated when you could accidentally slip into Korean during intimate moments or dream in Arabic. Most people found my linguistic abilities fascinating at first, then overwhelming. My mom called every Sunday, updates flowing in a mixture of English and Ukrainian depending on her mood. She'd married my stepfather, Victor, a kind man who appreciated her multilingual son even if he didn't fully understand what I did for work. But my father? Radio silence for 3 years. He asks about you, my mom would say carefully. He reads the newspaper articles when your name appears. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. He made his choice, Mom. Pride is a terrible prison, Tyler, for both of you. The turning point came during what seemed like a routine assignment. The Chinese delegation was visiting Washington for preliminary discussions about a new trade framework. These weren't the headline-grabbing summits you see on television. They were the technical, behind-the-scenes meetings where real policy gets hammered out. I'd worked with Chinese officials before, but this delegation was different. Led by Deputy Minister Chen Wei, they brought an unusual combination of economic experts, technology specialists, and cultural attachés. The American team included representatives from Commerce, Treasury, and the Pentagon, a sign that these talks touched on sensitive areas. The first day proceeded normally. I translated discussions about tariff structures, intellectual property protections, and market access agreements. My Mandarin was flawless, my understanding of both American and Chinese bureaucratic language precise. But I noticed something the others missed. Subtle references in the Chinese delegation's private conversations that suggested this was preliminary to something much bigger. During a break, Deputy Minister Chen approached me directly, speaking in rapid, colloquial Mandarin that most interpreters would struggle with. Your linguistic abilities are exceptional, he said, but more impressive is your cultural intuition. You understand not just our words, but our meaning. Thank you, Minister Chen. I've had excellent teachers. He studied me carefully. We've been observing your work for some time, Mr. Henderson. Your reputation extends beyond Washington. Our Cultural Research Division has files on fewer than 12 American interpreters. You're one of them. This was unusual. Government officials rarely discussed intelligence gathering so directly, even in private conversation. Something was building. The next morning brought an unexpected development. My supervisor, Janet Morrison, called me into her office with an expression I'd never seen before. Part excitement, part nervous energy. Tyler, I need you to sit down for this. What's happening? We just received a request through diplomatic channels. The Chinese premier, not a deputy, not a minister, but Premier Li Xiaoping himself, is making an unscheduled stop in Washington next week. And he specifically requested you as his primary interpreter. The room went silent except for the humming of Janet's computer. Premier Li Xiaoping was the second most powerful person in China, the head of government who managed the world's second-largest economy. He didn't make unscheduled stops. He didn't request specific interpreters. That's impossible, I said. Premiers work with their own interpreters. They don't trust critical communications to foreign nationals. Apparently this one does. The request came through Ambassador Williams directly. They want you, Tyler. Only you. Janet handed me a classified briefing folder. This isn't a trade talk. This is preliminary discussion for a potential state visit by President Chen himself. The premier is coming to assess whether high-level dialogue is possible. If these conversations go well, we're looking at the most significant diplomatic breakthrough with China in a decade. I opened the folder and felt my stomach drop. The topics weren't just sensitive, they were the kinds of issues that could reshape global politics. Technology transfer agreements that could affect military balance. Economic partnerships that could shift trade power worldwide. Cultural exchange programs that could influence how two superpowers understood each other. Why me? I asked. Janet smiled. Because according to their cultural research, you're the only American interpreter who truly understands both languages at the level required for this conversation. They've studied your work, Tyler. They know about your linguistic abilities, your cultural sensitivity, your discretion. Premier Lee apparently said, and I quote, "If we're going to trust anyone with words that could change history, it should be someone who treats language as sacred." The weight of it hit me. This was beyond career advancement. This was potentially career-defining. The kind of assignment that would either establish me as one of the world's premier diplomatic interpreters or destroy my career if anything went wrong. "There's more," Janet continued. "The premier specifically requested that the preliminary meeting be informal, not at the State Department, not at the Chinese embassy. He wants to meet at a neutral location where he can assess the interpreter, you, in a relaxed environment." Where? The Kennedy Center. During the National Symphony Orchestra's performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, he'll be in the diplomatic box, you'll join him. The actual conversation will happen during intermission, in a private reception room. My mind raced. This was unprecedented. World leaders didn't conduct preliminary diplomatic assessments at cultural events with foreign interpreters they'd never met, unless... He's testing me, I realized. This isn't just about translation. He wants to see how I handle pressure, how I think, how I represent American interests, while respecting Chinese cultural values. Janet nodded. Exactly. And Tyler, everything depends on this going well. If Premier Lee is impressed, the state visit happens. If he's not, she didn't need to finish. That evening, I called my mom. For the first time in years, I needed to share something I couldn't handle alone. "Mamo," I said, using the Ukrainian word that always made her cry, "something incredible is happening." I told her everything I could without violating security protocols. About the premier's request, about the unprecedented nature of the meeting, about what it could mean for my career and for international relations. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "But Tyler, you need to call your father." "Mom, no, he made it clear. He reads every article about your work. Every single one. Victor finds him sometimes, late at night, looking up your name on that computer at the library. He's proud of you, Tyler. He's just too stubborn and too ashamed to admit he was wrong. This isn't the time for family reconciliation. This is exactly the time. You're about to meet with one of the most powerful people in the world. You're going to represent our country in conversations that could shape the future. Don't you think your father should know that his son, the son he called worthless, is about to make history?" That night, I stared at my phone for 2 hours before finally dialing my father's number. It rang 4 times before his gruff voice answered. "Hello? Dad, it's Tyler." Silence. Then, "Tyler, your mother said you might call." "Dad, I wanted to tell you something about my work." "I know what you do. I read the papers." This surprised me. "You do?" Another long pause. "I may not understand it, but I'm not blind. My son works for the government. Important work." "Dad, next week I'm meeting with the Chinese premier. He requested me personally. Me, specifically, out of all the interpreters in America." Quote. The silence stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. "Dad? The premier of China wants to meet with you?" "Yes." "Because of your languages?" "Because of my languages." For the first time in years, my father's voice cracked. "Jesus, Tyler. I don't even know what that means, but it sounds important." "It is important, Dad. It's the most important thing I've ever done." "Tyler?" His voice was softer now, uncertain. I think maybe I was wrong about some things." The Kennedy Center glowed against the Washington night sky as I approached in the State Department car. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted my cufflinks, a nervous habit I'd developed before high-stakes assignments. But this wasn't just high stakes. This was unprecedented. Security's unlike anything I'd experienced. Instead of the usual diplomatic protocols, discreet agents positioned themselves throughout the building. The Chinese advance team had swept every inch of the premier's route. Even the symphony musicians had undergone additional background checks. In the diplomatic reception area, I met Ambassador Patricia Williams, a seasoned diplomat whose poker face had intimidated foreign ministers for 2 decades. Tonight, she looked genuinely nervous. "Tyler, I need to be crystal clear about what's happening here," she said, leading me to a private briefing room. "Premier Lee's request isn't just unusual, it's historically unprecedented. In 40 years of diplomatic service, I've never seen anything like this. She handed me a sealed envelope. These are the actual topics he wants to discuss. We received them an hour ago through encrypted channels. I opened the envelope and felt my breath catch. The subjects weren't just politically sensitive. They were the foundation of future U.S.-China relations. Economic partnerships worth trillions of dollars. Technology sharing agreements that could affect military balance for decades. Cultural exchange programs involving millions of students and professionals. He wants to discuss all of this during intermission, I asked. No, Ambassador Williams said quietly. He wants to discuss whether you're capable of handling all of this during a future state visit. Tonight is your audition, Tyler. He's not just meeting with an interpreter. He's evaluating whether America has someone who can facilitate the most important diplomatic conversations of our generation. The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders like lead. This wasn't about my career anymore. This was about whether two superpowers could find common ground through language. There's something else, the ambassador continued. The premier speaks perfect English. He doesn't need an interpreter for basic communication. He wants to see how you handle the untranslatable cultural concepts, political nuances, emotional subtleties that can make or break international relationships. At 7:30, the National Symphony Orchestra began Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. I took my position in the diplomatic box, a small, elegantly appointed space overlooking the concert hall. 5 minutes later, Premier Li Xiaoping entered. He was smaller than I'd expected, with intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. His English was indeed perfect, but I noticed immediately that he occasionally paused, not searching for words, but choosing them with diplomatic precision. Mr. Henderson, he said in English, extending his hand. Thank you for accommodating this unusual request. The honor is mine, Premier Li. I hope you enjoy the performance. He smiled slightly. Beethoven transcends language, doesn't it? Though I suspect you could translate his passion into any tongue. We listened to the first movement in comfortable silence. I found myself studying his reactions, noting how he responded to different musical phrases. During the more dramatic passages, his expression revealed an emotional depth that most Western media never captured. As the first movement concluded, he leaned toward me and began speaking in rapid, formal Mandarin. The music reminds me of my grandfather's stories about building bridges across impossible rivers. He said the secret wasn't engineering, it was understanding what each side truly needed to cross safely. This was it. The test had begun. I responded in equally formal Mandarin, matching his linguistic register perfectly. Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. Sometimes the most challenging bridges are built not with steel, but with understanding. His eyes sharpened. For the next 20 minutes, he switched between languages. Formal Mandarin, colloquial dialects I'd only heard in remote Chinese provinces. Even classical Chinese phrases that most native speakers wouldn't recognize. Each time, I matched him perfectly, not just translating words, but capturing cultural context, emotional undertones, and political implications. During the second movement, he began discussing Chinese philosophy in a dialect from Hunan province, his birthplace, which I'd researched extensively. He was testing whether I understood not just his words, but his cultural foundation. The water that flows around the stone eventually shapes it, he said in the dialect. But only if the water truly understands the stone's nature. I responded in the same dialect, adding a complementary proverb, and the stone that learns from the water's patience becomes part of the river's song. He paused, studying me with new interest. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a genuine sound of delight. Remarkable, he said in English. You don't just speak our languages. You think in them. During intermission, we moved to a private reception room where the real conversation began. What happened next was unlike any diplomatic exchange I'd ever witnessed. Premier Li didn't discuss policy directly. Instead, he told stories. About his childhood during economic reforms. About watching his country transform while trying to preserve its cultural soul. About the challenge of leading 1 billion people while maintaining relationships with the rest of the world. Each story required me to translate not just language but cultural context that could take hours to explain. The concept of face in Chinese culture. The American notion of individual opportunity. The way historical memory shapes present-day politics in both nations. Mr. Henderson, he said finally, switching to English, I have a confession. I've been studying your work for 8 months. Not just your translations, but your cultural intuition. The way you handle sensitive concepts without losing their essence. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder I recognized. Transcripts of my previous diplomatic assignments, annotated in Chinese. Your interpretation during the Taiwan trade discussions last year prevented a major misunderstanding. The American negotiator used a phrase that literally translated would have been deeply insulting. You found a way to convey his intent while preserving dignity on both sides. I remembered that moment. The American had said something was a no-brainer, which in literal Chinese translation implies mental deficiency. I'd translated it as an obvious choice, preserving the meaning while avoiding offense. Language is a living bridge, I said. My job isn't just accuracy, it's understanding. Premier Li nodded slowly. This is why I requested you specifically. Next month, President Chen will visit Washington for the first time in 8 years. The conversations we have will determine the relationship between our nations for the next decade. We need someone who can translate not just words, but intentions. Someone who can help two very different cultures find common ground. The third movement of the symphony began, but neither of us was listening to Beethoven anymore. There will be moments, he continued, when a single mistranslated phrase could derail months of preparation. When cultural misunderstanding could create international incidents. When the fate of billions of people depends on whether two leaders truly understand each other. He paused, looking directly into my eyes. I am prepared to recommend to President Chen that you serve as primary interpreter for the state visit. But I need to know, can you handle that responsibility? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd proven to myself and others, came down to this moment. Premier Li, I said in perfect Mandarin, I've spent my entire life building bridges between worlds. This is what I was born to do. He smiled, the first truly warm expression I'd seen from him all evening. Then we have an understanding. Mr. Henderson, you'll be hearing from our embassy very soon. What we're about to attempt hasn't been successful in decades. But perhaps, with the right translator, we can achieve something remarkable. As the symphony concluded with Beethoven's triumphant Ode to Joy, Premier Li shook my hand one final time. Your father must be very proud, he said unexpectedly. The comment caught me off guard. Sir? A man who raised a son capable of bridging worlds, that is a rare achievement. If only he knew the truth about my father's opinion. But as I watched Premier Li leave, surrounded by his security detail, I realized something had fundamentally changed in my life. Not just professionally, but personally. I was no longer the young man desperate for his father's approval. I was someone world leaders trusted with their most important communications. And maybe, just maybe, it was time my father knew exactly what his son had become. 2 weeks after the Kennedy Center meeting, my life became a whirlwind of classified briefings, security clearances, and preparation for what diplomatic circles were calling the most significant state visit in a generation. The Chinese embassy had formally requested me as primary interpreter for President Chen's visit. The State Department had agreed. And suddenly, Tyler Henderson from Detroit was at the center of international attention. The preparation was intense. Daily briefings on economic policy, military cooperation, technological partnerships, and cultural exchanges. I studied every nuance of both leaders' speaking styles, their preferred phrases, their political sensitivities. The margin for error was zero. But something else was happening, something I hadn't expected, media attention. It started with a small article in the Washington Post, local interpreter selected for historic China summit. Then CNN picked it up, the American who speaks China's language. Within days, my story was everywhere. The kid from Detroit who mastered 11 languages, the son of a factory worker chosen to facilitate conversations between superpowers. My mom called, crying with joy. Tyler, there's a reporter at my door asking about you. The neighbors are bringing me flowers. Mrs. Chen from downstairs says you're famous in China too. Mom, please don't give any interviews. This is sensitive diplomatic work. Too late, she laughed. I already told them about the time you translated for Mr. Petrov when you were 7, and about your father's reaction. My heart sank. Mom, what did you say about Dad? The truth. That he didn't understand your gift at first, but that parents sometimes need time to see their children clearly. That evening, my phone rang. My father's number. Tyler, I need to see you. Dad, I'm incredibly busy right now. I know what you're doing. I saw the news. My son is going to interpret for the president of China. His voice carried an emotion I'd never heard before. Wonder, maybe, or disbelief. Dad, I'm driving to Washington. Tomorrow, we need to talk. The line went dead before I could respond. The next afternoon, my father arrived at my apartment looking older than I remembered, but carrying himself differently. Gone was the defeated posture of a man worn down by factory work. He stood straighter, his eyes brighter, like he was seeing the world through new glasses. This is where you live? He asked, looking around my apartment with its view of the Potomac, its walls covered with certificates and photos from diplomatic assignments. Yeah, Dad, this is home. He picked up a framed photo of me with Ambassador Williams and the German foreign minister. I don't understand any of this, he said quietly. I don't understand how my son went from being a weird kid who spoke too many languages to this. Dad, he held up his hand. Let me finish. I spent 3 years being angry that you left, angry that you chose a path I couldn't understand, angry that you proved me wrong. He set down the photo and turned to face me directly. But I wasn't really angry at you, Tyler. I was angry at myself. For being too small-minded to see what was right in front of me. For being too scared of anything different to recognize genius when it was sitting at my dinner table. This was not the conversation I'd expected. Your mother kept showing me articles about your work, about how you helped negotiate some trade deal with Japan, about how senators request you specifically for important meetings. And I kept thinking, that's my son. The boy I called worthless is making history, and I was too stupid to see it. He walked to my window, looking out at the city where his son had become someone he never imagined possible. I worked in that factory for 32 years, he continued. Same job, same routine, same small world. I thought that was real life. I thought anything else was fantasy. But you built something I can't even comprehend. Dad, You just what? You just mastered 11 languages? You just got chosen by world leaders? You just became the person who helps nations understand each other? He laughed. But it wasn't bitter anymore. It was amazed. Tyler, do you have any idea how extraordinary you are? For the first time in years, I felt something I'd forgotten, the desire for my father's approval. Not out of desperation now, but out of love. I wanted you to be proud of me, I said simply. Proud? He shook his head. Tyler, I'm not proud. Pride is what you feel when your kid hits a home run or graduates college. What I feel is awe. I'm in awe of who you became despite having a father too blind to encourage you. The next morning brought the most important day of my career, President Chen's arrival at Andrews Air Force Base, followed by a full day of meetings culminating in a state dinner. But first, something unprecedented happened. My father asked to attend. I know it's impossible, he said over breakfast. I know I have no right to ask, but Tyler, I need to see this. I need to see my son do what he was born to do. I made some calls, called in favors, spoke to people who owed me professional courtesies. By noon, Marcus Henderson had a visitor's pass to observe the afternoon session from the State Department's public gallery, a small viewing area where family members and dignitaries could watch historic moments unfold. The meeting took place in the Benjamin Franklin State Dining Room, with President Chen, Secretary of State Rodriguez, and a dozen high-ranking officials from both nations. I positioned myself between the two leaders, wearing the discreet earpiece and microphone that would allow me to provide simultaneous interpretation. As the conversations began, I felt that familiar transformation, my consciousness expanding to encompass both languages, both cultural contexts, both sets of political and emotional subtleties. This was what I lived for. This was who I was meant to be. President Chen opened with remarks about the importance of understanding between great nations. As I translated his formal Mandarin into English, I caught sight of my father in the gallery. He was leaning forward, transfixed, watching his son facilitate conversation between the leaders of the world's two most powerful countries. The discussions covered economic cooperation, technological partnerships, and cultural exchanges. Each topic required me to navigate linguistic complexity that most people couldn't comprehend. Technical terms that had no direct translations. Cultural concepts that needed careful explanation. Political nuances that could spark international incidents if mishandled. During a particularly complex exchange about intellectual property rights, President Chen used a classical Chinese phrase that referenced an ancient philosophical concept. The literal translation would have been meaningless to American ears. Instead, I translated the underlying meaning, while adding cultural context that helped the American team understand both the content and the emotional weight of his words. Secretary Rodriguez paused, looked at me with something approaching amazement, then responded in a way that showed he truly understood President Chen's position. A potential point of conflict became a moment of mutual respect. That's when I noticed my father. He was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. His mouth was slightly open, his hands gripping the gallery railing, his eyes wide with something between shock and revelation. As the formal session concluded, both leaders stood and shook hands. President Chen said something in Mandarin that I translated as, "Today we built bridges that will benefit both our peoples for generations." Then President Chen did something that stunned everyone in the room. He turned directly to me and spoke in English, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Mr. Henderson, your skill made this understanding possible. You are a gift to both our nations." The room erupted in applause. Diplomats, officials, security personnel, everyone was clapping for the interpreter. It was unprecedented. I looked up at the gallery and saw my father. He had gone completely pale. His hands were shaking. And then, as I watched in horror and amazement, Marcus Henderson, the man who had spent years mocking his son's linguistic abilities, collapsed. He didn't stumble. He didn't sit down heavily. He fainted, completely lost consciousness, and crumpled to the floor of the State Department gallery. Security rushed to help him, but even as they were checking his vital signs, I could see him coming around. The first thing he did when his eyes opened was look for me. Later, in the medical office where they'd taken him for observation, my father sat on an examination table looking embarrassed but somehow lighter than I'd ever seen him. "I'm fine," he kept telling the medic. I couldn't process what I was seeing." "Dad, what happened up there?" He looked at me with tears in his eyes. "Tyler, I watched the president of China thank my son for making peace possible. I watched world leaders applaud because of something you did, and I realized that everything I thought I knew about success, about value, about what matters in this world, I was completely wrong." He paused, struggling with words. "For 32 years, I measured worth by how much weight you could lift, how many hours you could work, how well you fit into a world I understood. But you built your own world, a world where understanding matters more than strength, where knowledge is power, where my weird kid who spoke too many languages became the person who helps nations understand each other." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I fainted because I finally saw my son clearly. And Tyler, what I saw was magnificent." That evening, at the state dinner, my father sat at the family table wearing a rented tuxedo, watching his son facilitate conversations between world leaders. Every few minutes, he would shake his head in wonder and whisper to my mother, "That's our boy. That's our Tyler." When President Chen raised a toast to the interpreters who make understanding possible, my father stood up so fast he nearly knocked over his chair, applauding louder than anyone else in the room. Later, as we walked out of the State Department together, my father put his arm around my shoulders, something he hadn't done since I was a child. "Tyler," he said, "I spent years being wrong about you. But I promise you this. I will spend the rest of my life making sure everyone knows how proud I am to be your father." And for the first time in my adult life, I truly believed him. The weeks following the state visit transformed my life in ways I never anticipated. What had started as a diplomatic assignment became a catalyst for changes that rippled far beyond my professional world. The media attention intensified. CNN featured a documentary segment called The Bridge Builder, Tyler Henderson's Linguistic Journey. The New York Times profiled me in their Sunday magazine. International outlets picked up the story, how an American interpreter had facilitated breakthrough conversations between two superpowers. But the most unexpected development came from China itself. 3 weeks after President Chen's visit, I received a call from the Chinese Cultural Ministry. They were launching an unprecedented initiative, a bilateral language exchange program between American and Chinese universities. They wanted me to design the curriculum and serve as its first director. Mr. Henderson, said Minister Wang during our video conference, your work during the state visit demonstrated something we've been seeking for years, true cultural bridge building. We believe you could help create a generation of young people who understand both our nations deeply. The program would involve American students spending 2 years in China while Chinese students studied in America. But unlike traditional exchange programs, this would focus on diplomatic and cultural interpretation, training the next generation of people who could facilitate international understanding. It was an honor beyond anything I'd imagined, but it also meant a decision that would reshape my entire future. Meanwhile, my relationship with my father had entered territory neither of us knew how to navigate. After years of distance and misunderstanding, we were suddenly trying to build a connection based on mutual respect, rather than childhood dynamics. He started calling every few days, not to check up on me, but to genuinely understand my work. Explain to me again how you knew what President Chen really meant when he said that thing about rivers, he'd ask. Or, I saw on the news that you're working with some German officials next week. How many German words do you actually know? His curiosity was genuine, almost childlike. The man who had once dismissed languages as worthless was now fascinated by every aspect of what I did. But the most significant change came when he started attending my mom's Ukrainian community events. Your father asked me to teach him some Ukrainian, my mom told me during one of our Sunday calls. He says he wants to understand where half of you comes from. This floored me. My father, who had spent years complaining about foreign languages in his own home, was voluntarily learning Ukrainian. How's he doing? I asked. My mom laughed. Terrible. His pronunciation is awful, and he keeps mixing up verb conjugations. But Tyler, he practices every day. Every single day. A month later, my father called me speaking halting, heavily accented Ukrainian. Sin-mi, he said, my son, I am trying to learn your mother's language. His grammar was wrong and his accent was thick as molasses, but the effort behind those words meant everything. Dad, your Ukrainian is... I searched for the right word. It's beautiful. It's terrible, he laughed. But your mother is patient. She says learning languages keeps the brain young. Maybe she's right. The Chinese Cultural Ministry program required me to spend 6 months in Beijing, working with educational officials to establish the framework. It was an opportunity that could define my career for decades, but it meant leaving Washington just as my relationship with my father was finding new ground. The night before my flight to Beijing, my parents drove down from Detroit. My father had insisted on taking me to dinner at one of Washington's most exclusive restaurants, the kind of place he would have once dismissed as pretentious. I want to see how the other half lives, he said, but he was smiling. Plus, I figure my son deserves the best. During dinner, he surprised me again. Tyler, I've been thinking about what you do, really thinking about it, and I realize I spent years being afraid of something I didn't understand. Languages, other cultures, people who were different from me. Quote. He paused, looking around the restaurant where conversations flowed in multiple languages. But watching you work, seeing how you help people understand each other, I think what you do might be the most important job in the world. Dad, that's... Let me finish. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small wrapped package. I wanted to give you something before you leave for China. Inside was a vintage compass, brass and beautifully crafted. It belonged to my grandfather, your great-grandfather. He was an immigrant too, came here from Ireland when he was 16. He gave this to my father, who gave it to me when I started at the factory. I turned the compass over. Engraved on the back were words in what looked like Gaelic. What does it say? My father smiled sheepishly. I don't know. I never bothered to find out. But I figure you could translate it for me sometime. The inscription read, "May you always find your way to understanding." Dad, this is incredible. But are you sure you want me to have it? Tyler, you've spent your life finding your way to understanding. Seems like it belongs with you. Beijing exceeded every expectation. Working with Chinese educators, I helped design a program that would bring together students from both nations in ways never attempted before. The pilot program would start with 50 students from each country, but plans called for thousands within 5 years. During my time there, I also began working on something personal, a book about the role of interpretation in international diplomacy. Publishers in both countries had expressed interest, but more importantly, it felt like a way to share what I'd learned about building bridges between cultures. The Chinese officials I worked with treated me not just as a consultant, but as a cultural ambassador. They invited me to their homes, included me in family celebrations, shared perspectives on America that no diplomatic briefing had ever conveyed. "You understand us in a way most Americans do not," Professor Liu told me during one of our planning sessions. "But more importantly, you help us understand Americans better too." 3 months into my Beijing assignment, I received unexpected news. The United Nations had created a new position, Special Advisor on Linguistic Diplomacy. They wanted me to consider the role, which would involve training interpreters worldwide and developing protocols for high-stakes international negotiations. It was the kind of opportunity that comes once in a lifetime, but it would mean permanent relocation to New York and a complete shift in my career trajectory. I called my father from my hotel room in Beijing, needing his perspective for the first time in years. "The United Nations wants to hire you?" he said, his voice filled with disbelief. "Tyler, do you understand what you're telling me? The United Nations." "Dad, I need your advice. This would mean changing everything again. Leaving the State Department, moving to New York, taking on responsibilities I've never had before." "Tyler," he said quietly, "do you remember what you told me the night before you left for Georgetown? You said you'd rather fail pursuing something you believed in than succeed at something that made you miserable." I remembered. "Well, son, it seems like you've been proving that philosophy right for quite a while now. What does your gut tell you about this UN job?" I thought about it. The position would allow me to impact international communication on a global scale, to train interpreters who could prevent conflicts and facilitate understanding between nations worldwide. "It feels like what I've been preparing for my entire life," I admitted. "Then there's your answer. Tyler, I spent too many years being afraid of big dreams. Don't let my old fears become your limitations." 6 months later, I stood in the United Nations General Assembly Hall, taking the oath as the organization's first special advisor on linguistic diplomacy. In the gallery sat my parents, my mom weeping with pride, my father looking around in wonder at the flags of 193 nations. After the ceremony, as we walked through the UN corridors, my father stopped in front of a wall displaying the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in dozens of languages. "Tyler," he said, studying the different scripts and characters, "I think I'm finally beginning to understand what you saw in all this." He pointed to the various translations, all these different ways of saying the same important things, all these different peoples trying to understand each other. He turned to me with tears in his eyes. "You know what you are, son? You're not just an interpreter, you're a bridge. Between worlds, between people, between all of us who are trying to figure out how to live together on this planet." Quote. That evening, at the reception following my swearing in, diplomats from around the world approached my father, eager to meet the man who had raised the UN's linguistic diplomacy advisor. Each time someone complimented his son, Marcus Henderson stood a little straighter, smiled a little brighter, and said with unmistakable pride, "That's my boy. He speaks 11 languages, and he uses every one of them to help people understand each other." As I watched him that night, this man who had once called my linguistic abilities worthless, I realized something profound. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't professional achievements or international recognition. Sometimes they're simply moments when the people we love finally see us clearly. And sometimes, if we're very fortunate, we get to see them transform too. 5 years after that life-changing moment at the Kennedy Center, I found myself standing on a stage in Geneva, addressing the World Economic Forum's annual Global Communications Summit. The audience included heads of state, tech innovators, and cultural leaders from every continent. My presentation focused on a revolutionary concept we'd developed at the UN Real-Time Cultural Context Translation. Using artificial intelligence combined with human expertise, we could now provide not just linguistic translation, but cultural interpretation that prevented the misunderstandings that had sparked conflicts for centuries. Language, I told the audience, is never just about words. It's about the entire universe of meaning that surrounds those words. The pilot program had already prevented 3 potential diplomatic crises and facilitated trade agreements worth over $200 billion. Tech companies were licensing our methodologies. Universities worldwide were implementing our training protocols. But the most meaningful moment came after my presentation, when a young woman approached me backstage. Mr. Henderson, I'm Sarah Kim, a graduate student at Stanford. I'm Korean American, and I've been studying your interpretation techniques. Your work inspired me to become a diplomatic interpreter. She paused, seeming nervous. My parents didn't understand my choice at first. They wanted me to become a doctor or engineer. But I showed them your interviews, your story about your father. Now they call me their quote unquote quote unquote 20 unquote quote. These conversations happened regularly now. Young people from immigrant families who had been discouraged from pursuing linguistic careers were finding new paths because someone had proven it was possible to change the world through language. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual careers. The cultural exchange program I designed in Beijing had expanded to include universities in 47 countries. Over 10,000 students had participated, creating a global network of young people who understood multiple cultures intimately. My book, The Space Between Words, Language as Diplomacy, had been translated into 32 languages and was required reading in international relations programs worldwide. But more importantly, it had sparked conversations about the role of cultural understanding in preventing conflicts. That evening, I video called my parents from my hotel room in Geneva. My father, now retired, had become something of a local celebrity in Detroit. The neighborhood newspaper had featured him in an article titled, "The Factory Worker Whose Son Changed the World." "Tyler, I watched your speech online," he said, his face beaming through the screen. "I understood maybe half of what you were talking about, but I could tell it was important." He'd aged well in the 5 years since our reconciliation. Learning Ukrainian had indeed kept his mind sharp, and he'd surprised everyone by picking up basic Mandarin from online courses. "Dad, you've been learning Chinese for 2 years now. How's it going?" He attempted a few phrases, his pronunciation still terrible but his enthusiasm infectious. My mom, visible in the background, rolled her eyes affectionately. "He practices with the Chinese families at the community center," she said. "The children think he's hilarious." But then my father's expression grew serious. "Tyler, I need to tell you something. Last week, a reporter from the Detroit Free Press interviewed me for a story about successful people from the city. She asked me what I was proudest of in my life." He paused, looking directly into the camera. "I told her it wasn't my 32 years at the factory. It wasn't anything I accomplished. I told her I was proudest of the moment I finally understood who my son really was. The moment I stopped being afraid of his gifts and started celebrating them." 6 months later, I received news that would bring everything full circle. The Nobel Committee was considering creating a new category, the Nobel Prize for Communication and Understanding. They wanted me to serve on the selection committee and help establish criteria for recognizing individuals who had advanced global communication. The irony wasn't lost on me. The boy whose father had once called him a worthless show-off for speaking multiple languages was being asked to help determine who deserved the world's most prestigious recognition for communication excellence. My father flew to Oslo for the committee's inaugural meeting. As we walked through the Nobel Institute, he stopped at a display showing past laureates. "Someday," he said quietly, "your picture might be up there. Dad, that's not why I do this work." "I know," he smiled. "That's exactly why you might deserve it." That evening, at the reception for committee members, my father mingled with Nobel laureates, diplomats, and academics. I watched him explain my work to former Peace Prize winners, describing his son's career with a pride that radiated from every word. Later, as we stood on the balcony of the Nobel Institute overlooking Oslo, my father put his arm around my shoulders. "Tyler, do you know what I think about when I see all this?" "What, Dad?" "I think about that 7-year-old boy who wanted to help his mother talk to the landlord. That little kid who thought languages were magic." He paused, looking out at the city lights. "Turns out he was right. Languages are magic. And my son is a magician." As I stood there with my father, overlooking a city where the world's greatest peacemakers are honored, I realized that the most important translation I'd ever accomplished wasn't between nations or languages. It was helping my father translate his fear into understanding, his doubt into pride, his narrow view into a broader vision of what his son could become. The boy who had once hidden his linguistic abilities was now helping shape global communication policy. The father who had mocked those abilities was now their proudest advocate. Sometimes the greatest bridges we build aren't between countries or cultures. Sometimes they're between the people we used to be and the people we become. And sometimes, if we're very fortunate, we get to build those bridges with the people we love most. The 7-year-old who translated for his mother couldn't have imagined where those first words would lead. But he knew even then that language was about connection, about understanding, about building bridges between worlds. 30 years later, that's still exactly what it's about. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.